On social media, I've seen a number of parents of high support needs autistic family members calling for people with ASD-1 to be removed from the formally defined Autism Spectrum Disorder diagnosis, and for them to be assigned with a reinstated version of the former Asperger's syndrome. Back in 2013, I personally wasn't clapping and cheering for the DSM-5 restructuring of the old pervasive developmental disorder range. However, I see big problems with some of the justifications that have been presented to remove Asperger's equivalent presentations from autism spectrum disorder. One of these problems is that a significant number of the so-called autism parents that are saying this don't seem to believe that the former Asperger's syndrome was a legitimate disability diagnosis to begin with, and it certainly was. Contrary to the widespread casualized perception of Asperger's as a non-medical term for introverted, quirky geniuses with superpowers, savant talents, and trivial social hiccups, the actual Asperger's disorder was defined in the DSM-4 as a confluence of severe and sustained clinically significant impairments in social communication, occupational capability, and other important categories impacting their daily functionality. Many former Asperger's disorder candidates and diagnoses, as are of 2025, described as having level 1 autism spectrum disorder. And yet, when ASD-1 autistic people describe themselves as disabled, they may face backlash and disapproval from the parents of higher support needs autistic children, who sometimes accuse even clinically diagnosed ASD-1 patients of being out of line for supposedly wrongfully appropriating disability terminology as part of an identity fantasy. Considering that the non-disabled activist parents of high support needs autistic children are often vocally opposed to the self-identification of ASD, absent of professional involvement, for some of them to also target clinically diagnosed autistic people for supposedly wrongfully intruding into the disability community is highly hypocritical. The most extreme cases of this hypocrisy involve non-disabled people accusing clinically diagnosed ASD-1 patients of stealing disability support resources from truly autistic people, because according to these critics, disability services are for disabled people, and ASD-1 autism, aka low support needs or high functioning autism, isn't a disability. The fact that Asperger's disorder diagnoses were eligible for and were reliant upon extensive disability support services going back as far as over 30 years ago is only the starting point of proof against this discriminatory claim, which often depends on an implication that what some may call high-functioning autism was a non-scientific personal theory that was newly invented by neurodiversity proponents on TikTok and Tumblr, and then forced into the DSM-5 in 2013 due to pressure to validate the elective identities of politically driven activists, and all without established clinical practice or academic basis. Narratives such as these, which fundamentally mischaracterize ASD-1, are contrary to the actual contents of the DSM-5, which its critics consider weak and flabby for allegedly trivializing autism. Ironically, these implications are also contrary to ASD-1 equivalent diagnoses in the old DSM-4, which these people often say got classification of pervasive developmental disorders right by keeping Asperger's and autism as separate diagnoses. The semantic separation of Asperger's disorder and autistic disorder in the diagnostic manuals introduced in 1994 was never intended to elevate autism diagnoses as the real or true disabled people, while dismissing or discounting Asperger's diagnoses as non-disabled people with trivial personality quirks and no elements of clinically significant impairment or functional challenge. but many critics of the continued recognition of ASD-1 seemingly rely on this misrepresentation to call for high-functioning autism to be banished from discussion of disability and removed from consideration for research and supports. That observation of hypocrisy, of course, only applies to individuals who embrace those explicitly contradictory positions. And it is in fact possible to criticize the DSM-5 structuring of the neurodevelopmental disorder subheading and its definitions of disability without holding innocent disabled people in contempt and painting them as not only being intruders into the disability community, but as the natural opponents of higher support needs autistic people. But unfortunately, that's not what I'm seeing in a lot of these discussions. I'll see you all next time. Thanks for watching.